Hi, friends. Mr. Ling here. Apologize for the tears in my eye. I am crying because I had a coughing fit on the last video, on like the last slide. So I'm starting all over again. So these are tears of both coughing pain and the fact that I have to do this video all over again. But it's okay because I think this time is going to be even better than last time. And that's saying something because I had balloons and my puppy made an appearance. Those are both lies. But whatever. We'll do our best. Sorry I'm not there today. I'm actually down the hall. Excuse me if I start coughing. I'm just going to power through it on this one. I'm right down the hall in the Bible wing doing a hackathon. So pop by and say hi at some point today. I'm busy. I'm just not busy doing econ. Remember, your homework, which you'll actually have time to do in class today, is a video lecture on 5.5 through 5.7. So 3 concepts, 1 video. And then, of course, you have a Khan Academy for each of those, just 4 questions long for each of those. Knock them out, do your best on them, and we'll come back together and review it and emphasize it on Friday. Once we're done on Friday, we will review because the quiz is on Tuesday, which is your final thing you will do before Turkey Day. Gobble, gobble. All right, let's get into this. Topic 4.3 is long run impact of quantitative easing. Quick emphasis point, quantitative easing might be a new term for you. Quantitative easing, what are we talking about? It's expansionary monetary policy. So when the Federal Reserve increases the supply of money. It's a term that's normally used by monetarists who are critics of monetary policy, believe the Federal Reserve actually shouldn't exist. And so they use the term quantitative easing because it's easing the pain of our economy through increasing the quantity of money. And so it's kind of a derogatory term that they use to refer to this, what they think is a very dysfunctional type of policy. So let's get into it. Emphasis point number 1 is the long run impact of expansionary monetary policy. So, generally speaking, monetarists believe that expansionary monetary policy results in inflation and not an increase in GDP. That's the gist of it. If the only takeaway from this is that monetarists believe that hyperinflation results out of expansionary monetary policy, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Couple that with the equation of exchange, and you pretty much got the gist of this. But I want to make sure that you understand the logic behind it as well. So, Milton Friedman is kind of the founder of this entire school of thought. Milton Friedman had this illustration he always used to talk about this. He believes that this idea that an increase in supply of money results in an increase in investment is false. He says, hey, imagine that there's a helicopter just loaded down with cash, millions and millions of dollars, and it goes over Chicago, downtown Chicago, on the busiest street, busiest time of day, and opens its hatch, and just money goes everywhere. People are scrambling through the streets, they're grabbing the money out of the sky, they're stuffing it into bags, right? And then he says, what are those people going to do with that money? Right? And his audience members famously would say things like, oh, they're going to send their kids to college, or they're going to buy a new car, or they might put it in the savings, or they might go out to a fancy restaurant, right? Everyone brains fill with all the things that they could possibly do with this money. And Milton Friedman would just sit there kind of stoically and say, notice that nobody said that they were going to invest in capital goods, that they were going to build a factory or buy new machinery or make things more productive. Now, while the Federal Reserve doesn't use a helicopter, it's not all that different. Where they put the money is in the banks, and the people who have access to the money are similar to the people who have access to the money falling from the sky. It's people like you and me, and it's business owners. It's both and. And what he argues is that the majority of those funds are actually going to be used for consumption rather than being used for investment, right? With the onset of credit cards, the ability to borrow with the swipe of a card, there are many, many more loans being taken out every time one of those cards is swiped. So people actually consume the increase in the supply of money. That's an important difference. In fact, that divergent line of logic there changes everything about expansionary monetary policy. Think about it for a quick second. If the decrease or increase in supply of money results in a decrease in interest rate, which results in an increase in investment, that investment shifts aggregate demand to the right, but it triggers economic growth. Remember, we have more capital stock, we're going to have more productivity, which means we're going to have more growth in the future. If you believe that, like mainstream economists do, then expansionary monetary policy is the great blessing, right? Because it doesn't create debt, and it promotes economic growth. Let's do it. But Milton and all of the other monitors say, no, 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 no. That money is actually going to be used for consumption by people like you and me through our credit card debt, right? So instead, the C of Sig-Jixing goes up, aggregate demand shifts to the right, and then eventually aggregate supply shifts to the left, and all we're left with is the same old GDP. We had temporary gains, yes, but the same old GDP and an increase in price level, right? We use this logic right here. I believe there's no impact in investment in the short run, none, or at least very little, because, the helicopter money thing. So increase in the supply of money, shift to the right, decreases interest rate. They don't argue that point. But that decrease in interest rate is going to increase consumption first and foremost, not investment. So people like you and me start spending more money. When we spend more money because of this increase in aggregate demand, we actually increase our demand for money. So there's a secondary shift of demand for money to the right. That makes sense, right? When we need to buy more goods and services, we demand more money. And so that increase in demand of money actually offsets the decrease in interest rates, right? And so it undoes the gains that we temporarily had. So what are we left with? We're left with more money, and that more money results in inflation. Let me give you an example real quick, something that you know already. If there's no investment, then that means there's no economic growth in the long run, just inflation. So if we believe that the helicopter of money, the increase in supply of money, results in people increasing consumption, aggregate demand still shifts to the right. Price level rises. But there's a secondary shift of demand for money going to the right. As price level goes up, inflation, and as we need more money to buy the goods and services. So when demand for money shifts to the right, interest rates rise. In addition, there's upward pressure on wages. And both of those things cause aggregate supply to shift to the left. Notice we had a temporary gain in GDP, but it's not permanent. It is offset by a decrease in air supply. So we are back to our original GDP at QY, but our price level is much, much higher than it was before. In other words, expansionary monetary policy does not increase GDP or real GDP in the long run, it only creates inflation. And while you might say, hey, but wages will keep up with inflation, do they? Right? In reality, no. In reality, inflation actually outpaces the increase in our wages. Sure, we try to negotiate them, but businesses are incentivized to keep wages low so that they can keep profits high. So while what's causing this area of supply to shift to the left is not necessarily enough of an increase in wages to make our lives better. And the more that prices rise and wages stay the same, the harder our life is, and it can result in panic and potentially hyperinflation. That is the main critique here. Wrap it up in a nice, neat little bow here. Expansionary monetary policy, according to the critics, the monetarists, only increases the demand for money in the long run, which increases interest rate. As a result, aggregate supply will shift back to the left. And so we're only left with inflation. We're not left with economic growth. This is based on the assumption that when there's more money in circulation, it's going to be used for consumption and not investment. That's the logic there. Okay, so they use an equation of exchange to kind of back this up. The equation of exchange is money times velocity equals price times quantity. So you know most of these, money supply, you know what that is. Velocity is a newish term. That means the amount of times a dollar is spent in a given year. That's velocity. Price is price level, you know that. And quantity is the same thing as real GDP, right? So monetarists believe that velocity is relatively stable and quantity or real GDP increases at a pretty predictable rate. And that's true. We can predict within like a tenth of a percent what the change in real GDP is going to be in the future, right? We have a lot of data points on that. So if those 2 points are stable, when you increase the supply of money, it doesn't actually result in an increase in real GDP. Q isn't going up. It's stable. It's constant, in other words. What are you actually increasing? You're increasing price level. Now, that's an issue because price level goes up and it looks like the economy is doing better. But really, what's happening is nominal GDP is rising, not real GDP. In other words, an increase in money supply will only result in an increase in price level. You do have to know this equation. They'll have you plug different numbers in and indicate what nominal GDP is. So knowing that M times V equals nominal GDP is just as important as knowing M times V equals real GDP or equals price times quantity. So sometimes they just ask you for nominal GDP and they give you money supply and velocity. You have to know that P times Q equals nominal GDP. And then finally, remember the danger of all of this is that it can create hyperinflation in the future if we're not careful. Expansionary monetary policy is a problem. We use it because it looks like it works, but it's fool's gold. It actually has long run consequences that, of course, we don't know until we're in the long run. Okay, so emphasis point number three, how do you fix it? It's one thing to say, here's the critique. It's another thing to say, here's the fix. Monetarists believe that the best way to do this is something called the monetary rule. The monetary rule will help prevent inflation, maintain stability, but it gets rid of expansionary monetary policy as a thing. Get rid of it. Now they have a different list of things they want you to use, which we'll talk about in the next emphasis lecture. But right now they say get rid of expansionary monetary policy. In fact, we don't need a Federal Reserve at all. It's a relatively simple thing. If we can predict the percent change in real GDP, then we need to change the supply of money or the M in the same amount as quantity, right? So the percent change in supply of money should be equal to the percent change in real GDP. So if I believe that money or velocity is stable and I want to keep price levels stable because I don't want to create inflation, then when I know I can predict that real GDP or Q equals 3% is going to go up by 3%, then I simply increase the supply of money through the same mechanisms by 3%. That way, people have enough money to buy real GDP, but not so much money that it creates this vicious cycle that can potentially lead to hyperinflation. That's the monetary rule. That's the solution to their critique. Okay, here's a quick question for you. See if you can get this. Given a constant velocity of money, in the short run, a 5% increase in money supply will translate to a 5% increase in nominal GDP. If I know that velocity is the same, then a 5% change in money supply will result in a 5% change in nominal GDP. How do I know that? Because I know M times V equals P times Q. And I know P times Q is nominal GDP. All right, here's another one. Hyperinflation is typically caused by B, continuous expansion of money supply to finance government budget deficits. In other words, if we continually increase the supply of money, it can potentially result in hyperinflation. Okay, last concept to emphasize for the day, concept 5.4, government deficits and national debt. Let's emphasize. This one's really quick. It's pretty simple. Expansionary policy, which is an increase in government spending or decrease in tax. We're talking fiscal policy now. That always results in an increase in the deficit or the creation or movement towards a deficit is often the language they use, movement towards a deficit. Why? Well, spending went up, government spending, so spending is high. Taxes went down, which is our revenue. So spending went up, revenue went down. That creates a deficit. I'm spending more than I'm bringing in. That's a deficit. So if you run an annual deficit, that's going to result in an increase in national debt. Remember, national debt is the accumulation of all deficits and all surpluses since the beginning of our economy. That's our total debt. So whenever we run a deficit for a given year, then it's an increase in national debt. The opposite is true as well. In the event that we utilize contractionary fiscal policy, whether this is intentional or this is non-discretionary, it's going to result in an increase in tax revenue and a decrease in government spending. Those are the things you do to contract our economy. You know this already. But what's that going to result in? Actually creates a surplus. Why? Well, taxes went up, so revenues are increasing. Spending went down, so spending is decreasing. So we have more money in the coffers that creates a surplus when revenue is greater than spending. The terminology they often use is we are moving towards a surplus. So that results in a decrease in national debt because you add a surplus to it, which helps pay down our debt in a given year. So remember, expansionary fiscal policy has an impact on the deficit and the debt, whether that's expansionary or contractionary. Cool. All right, that's it. Go on to CB 5.3 and 5.4. Also, make sure that you do your homework video that's available for you as well, and those Khan Academies. That should be plenty to keep you busy for the day. And then we should be right on track for doing this thing on Friday. All right, wrapping it all up. Thank you so much. Sorry again, I can't be there. Talk to you guys real soon.